Get her out of my kitchen." Chef Voss didn't lower his voice when he said it. He didn't need to. The whole line heard him. The sous chef, the two prep cooks, the dishwasher, who'd been pretending not to listen since the moment Sera walked in. They all heard, and not one of them said a word. Sera Drummond set down her knife, slowly, the way her grandmother had taught her to set down anything sharp when her hands were shaking, not because she was afraid, but because she was furious, and those two things felt the same in her body. She'd been at Maison 41 days, 41 days of arriving before 5 a.m., 41 days of prepping stocks, breaking down whole animals, trimming fat with a precision that made the other cooks pause and look, even when they pretended they weren't looking. 41 days of Voss walking past her station without acknowledgement, as though she were part of the equipment, a stand mixer, a sheet pan, something that functioned but did not deserve a name. She had not expected warmth. She hadn't come to Maison for warmth. She'd come because it was the best kitchen in the state of Georgia, because a stage here meant something, and because when her culinary instructor at Dawson Community College, not the CIA, not Johnson & Wales, Dawson Community College, had written her recommendation, he'd put his own reputation on the line to get her through the door. So she kept her mouth shut and she worked. Until the night of the 41st day, when Voss decided to make an example. It started with a sauce. Not her sauce, that was the thing. It was a beurre blanc that one of the junior cooks, a 23-year-old named Prescott, who'd trained in Paris, had broken halfway through service. The butter had split, the emulsion was gone. The table waiting on the halibut had been sitting for 11 minutes. And Prescott was standing there, staring at the pan like he was watching his own funeral. Sera had stepped in without thinking. That was how it happened. Not a decision, just the body moving toward a problem, the way water moves toward low ground. She'd pulled the pan, lowered the heat, added a cold tablespoon of butter, worked it back slowly. In less than 90 seconds, the sauce was smooth again. She'd handed it to the expeditor without a word. The halibut went out. The table was happy. Voss had seen all of it. He waited until the end of service. He always waited. That was one of the first things Sera had learned about him. He didn't yell during the rush. He saved it. Let it sit in him like something curdling. And then when the kitchen was quiet and the cooks were tired and their guards were down, he opened the valve. He walked to the center of the kitchen. Everyone was still cleaning their stations. He didn't call Sera by name. He pointed. "You, come here." She crossed the kitchen. She stood in front of him. She was 5'4", he was 6'2". He used every inch of that difference. "What you did tonight," he said, "was interfere with another cook station during active service." "The sauce was broken," she said. "The table had been waiting. I didn't ask for your explanation." She closed her mouth. "You have been in my kitchen for 6 weeks, Voss said. He was speaking at a volume that filled the room. He knew it filled the room. "In that time, I have watched you operate with a level of confidence that is, frankly, embarrassing. You come from a community college. You have no formal training. You have never worked in a restaurant above the tier of a mid-market hotel banquet, and yet you conduct yourself as though you belong here." No one was cleaning anymore. "Chef," she started. "I'm speaking." His voice dropped, which was somehow worse than if it had risen. "I pulled your resume this week. Do you know what I found? 2 years at a Marriott. 1 year at a place in Macon that closed. A catering company." He paused. "A catering company, Sera. You've been plating chicken for weddings." Quiet laughter from somewhere near the guard manger station. She didn't look to see who. "I don't know what Instructor Bellamy told you," Voss continued, "or what he told this kitchen about you, but I will tell you plainly what I see. I see someone who was given an opportunity she did not earn, who has spent 6 weeks trying to prove things she cannot prove, and who tonight overstepped in a way that could have cost a guest their meal." He tilted his head. "In a real kitchen, you understand. That is a terminable offense." Sera said nothing. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the rest of the kitchen. At the sous chef, at Prescott, at the prep cooks still frozen at their stations, and he spread his hand slightly, the gesture of a man demonstrating something obvious. "This is what happens," he said, "when you let people in through the side door." She drove home that night on the interstate, with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. She didn't cry. She'd learned a long time ago that crying in a car while driving was a luxury she couldn't afford. She needed her eyes. She needed to stay on the road. So she held it the way she'd held everything for the past 11 years. Tight. in the center of the chest, below the collarbone, where it could be managed. The apartment she was renting was a one-bedroom in Decatur, with a water stain on the bathroom ceiling and a window air conditioner that rattled like something was dying inside it. She'd moved there 8 months ago when she left the catering company and decided, at 31 years old, to find out once and for all whether what she could do in a kitchen was real or if she'd just been telling herself a story. She sat on the edge of her bed and took off her chef's coat. Her arms, bare now, told the story that Voss didn't know. The scars ran from just below the right elbow to the wrist, pale and ridged, some thin as thread, some wider, the topography of old damage. A few were from the kitchen, grease burns, a gash from a mandolin when she was 22. Most were not from the kitchen. She was 16 when her mother's boyfriend had shattered the glass shelf in the hallway and dragged her arm across it. 17 when the second incident happened. 18 when she left the house in Valdosta with $40 and a change of clothes and never went back. She did not wear short sleeves at work. She had not worn short sleeves in public in 13 years. She sat with her arms in her lap and looked at the wall and thought about what Voss had said. Not the cruelty of it. She'd been the recipient of cruelty before. Cruelty was a thing she knew how to catalog and set aside. She thought about the specific architecture of his argument, the way he'd laid it out like a legal brief, the resume, the community college, the catering company. He hadn't been entirely wrong about her history. He'd been completely wrong about what her history meant. She went back the next morning. This surprised people. She could tell by the way the prep cooks looked at her when she walked in at 4:52 a.m. A look that contained something between respect and confusion, like watching an animal return to a trap that had already sprung on it. She didn't explain herself. She put on her coat, she tied her apron, and she began her prep. What Voss did not know, what almost no one in that kitchen knew, was that Sera had been cooking professionally since she was 19 years old. Not in restaurants with Michelin ambitions and marble countertops, but in the places where the food actually had to be good. Church suppers in Tifton, where 200 people needed to be fed on a budget of $8 a head. A private household in Savannah, where she'd spent 3 years cooking for a family of 8. Every dietary restriction imaginable, the kind of cooking that required more actual technique than anything she'd seen at Maison. Because there was no brigade to cover your mistakes. The catering company Voss had dismissed was a company she'd helped build from a side operation, running out of a rented church kitchen, to a business with 12 employees and a client list that included the mayor's office. She'd left it because she'd given away most of what she'd built, and she'd done that because the woman who'd co-founded it with her needed the money more than Sera did. And Sera had made her peace with that. The Marriott, the mid-market hotel banquet, that had been survival. Those 2 years had also been where she'd taught herself every classic sauce in Escoffier, working through the book in her apartment after double shifts because she had no formal education. And she intended to close that gap on her own. She had not told Voss any of this at the time he was speaking. There hadn't been a moment to. And she wasn't sure, even now, that it would have changed anything. Men like Voss did not update their assessments based on new information. They built a story, and they lived in it. What she was going to do, she had decided somewhere on the interstate between the exit for Tucker and the exit for Decatur, was make the story impossible to ignore. 3 weeks later, Maison received a call. It came to the front of house manager, a meticulous woman named Odette, who ran the reservation book like a military operation, and who appeared in the kitchen doorway at 2:15 in the afternoon, with an expression Sera had never seen on her face before. The call was from the James Beard Foundation. They were sending a committee, not for an award consideration, not yet, but for an evaluation visit, the kind that preceded consideration, the kind that kitchens spent years positioning themselves for. Someone on the committee had eaten at Maison 2 months prior and had submitted an internal recommendation. The visit would occur in 11 days. Voss took the news with a stillness that was almost frightening. Then he called the entire kitchen together, and he outlined in precise detail what the next 11 days would look like. Every dish needed to be perfect. Every technique needed to be flawless. He looked at each cook in turn. When his gaze reached Sera, it moved on without stopping. In the week that followed, something happened in the kitchen that Sera hadn't expected. The junior cooks started coming to her. Not openly, not in front of Voss, but during the quiet hours in the morning, during prep, they would drift to her station and ask questions. About temperatures, about ratios, about the way she was breaking down the lamb's shoulder, about why she was resting the stock uncovered instead of sealed. She answered all of them. She didn't make a thing of it, she just answered. Prescott came to her on the 8th day. He stood at her station for a moment without speaking, then said, "The sauce that night. You didn't have to do that." "The table had been waiting 11 minutes, she said. "I know." He paused. "I wouldn't have caught it in time." She looked at him. "You would have figured it out." "I don't know that I would have." She went back to her work. "You know it now," she said. "That's the point." The committee arrived on a Wednesday. There were 3 of them. 2 women and a man, dressed in civilian clothes, seated in the dining room like regular guests. Voss had briefed the kitchen that morning. They would not be acknowledged. They would not be treated differently. The kitchen would perform at its highest standard as it did every service. The first 2 courses went out cleanly. The 3rd course was where the problem happened. The problem was the sauce, again. Not a broken emulsion this time. Something worse. The main protein for the evening was a seared duck breast with a cherry gastrique, and somewhere in the execution, the gastrique had been over-reduced. It wasn't catastrophically wrong. To most palates, it might have passed, but it was too sweet, too thick, and the acidity that was supposed to cut through the fat of the duck was gone. Sera knew it the moment the first plate was dressed. She looked at the expeditor. The expeditor looked at the sous chef. The sous chef looked at the plated dish, and then, for a long moment, at the pass. Voss was at the pass. He looked at the plate. He picked up a spoon. He tasted the gastrique. And then he set the spoon down very carefully, and there was a silence in the kitchen that lasted approximately 4 seconds, which in the middle of service feels like standing at the edge of a very tall building. "Hold the duck," he said. The table waiting on the duck was the committee's table. Voss looked at the sauce pot. He looked at the remaining gastrique. He looked at the clock. Then he looked up, and his eyes, moving across the line, landed on Sera. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a direct instruction. It was something else. A look that contained, somewhere inside its hardness, a thing that Voss had probably not felt in a very long time. Something that might have been uncertainty. Sera had already stepped away from her station. She came to the pass. She looked at the gastrique in the pot. She looked at what was available. The station had cherries. It had red wine vinegar. It had a knob of cold butter and a sprig of thyme. She looked at the clock. 11 minutes, she said. Not a question. Voss said nothing. Which meant yes. She built it from the beginning. Not the same sauce. There wasn't time to do it exactly the same way. A different approach, a faster reduction with the vinegar hitting differently, the cherries going in whole and then being pressed through the strainer to give the body she needed, a whisper of butter at the end to round the edge. She tasted it with a clean spoon. Tasted it again, adjusted. The committee's duck went out in 9 minutes and 40 seconds. She was back at her station before Voss said a word. He found her after service. Not in the kitchen, in the alley behind the restaurant, where the cooks sometimes went to stand in the cold air for 10 minutes before driving home. She was standing against the brick wall with her arms crossed, not because she was cold, but because the night air felt necessary after 4 hours in the heat. He came out the back door. He stood a few feet away from her. He didn't look at her directly at first. He looked out at the alley, at the dumpsters, at the strip of dark sky between the buildings. That was a burr-based cherry reduction, he said finally, without the original prep. Yes, you've done that before. Not that exact sauce. The technique, yes. He was quiet for a moment. A truck passed at the end of the alley. Where did you learn it? He said. She considered the question. Private household, she said. Savannah. The family had a cherry orchard. In season, we went through a case of fruit a week. You learn to work fast or you lose the fruit. He didn't respond to that. The truck sound faded. The committee, he said. They'll have tasted the difference from the first course. They'll know the sauce changed. Probably, Sera said. That's a problem for the evaluation. She looked at him. With respect, she said. The problem for the evaluation was the over-reduced gastrique that went out on the first plating attempt. What I did was limit the damage. He turned to look at her then. In the low light of the alley, she could see something working in his face, the kind of internal reckoning that doesn't look like humility but costs about the same. You could have said something at the pass, he said, when I tasted it. You could have offered immediately. You needed to make the call, she said. It was your kitchen, your service. He looked at her for a long time. Where did you actually train? He said. Dawson Community College, she said, and every kitchen that let me in after that. The evaluation report came back 3 weeks later. Odette brought it to Voss in his office at 10 in the morning. The junior cooks didn't know what it said until noon, when Voss called the kitchen together. Not at the end of service, not in the charged quiet after a hard night, but in the calm midday, which meant something. He read the relevant section aloud. The committee had noted the duck course. They had specifically noted the sauce. Not the first attempt, which they had apparently also tasted with the first dish of the 3-person table, but the corrected version. The report used the phrase, mid-service recovery of exceptional quality. It listed the cherry gastrique specifically as a highlight of the meal. Maison was being recommended for full committee consideration. The kitchen was quiet for a moment after Voss finished reading. Then Prescott started clapping, and the sound spread down the line, and the room was loud for about 30 seconds in a way it almost never was. Sauce. Then he looked at Sera. You'll be promoted to junior sous chef, effective next week, he said. Talk to Odette about the paperwork. He walked back toward his office. At the door he stopped. He didn't turn around. But his voice, directed at the wall, carried clearly through the kitchen. I was wrong about your resume, he said. I read the credential and not the cook. He paused. That doesn't happen in my kitchen. I won't let it happen again. Then he went into his office and closed the door. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Prescott said, low, to no one in particular. Did he just apologize? And Sera, pulling her apron strings tighter, said nothing. But the corner of her mouth moved. The night of the announcement, she sat in her car in the parking structure for a few minutes before driving home. She took off her chef's coat and folded it on the passenger seat. Her arms were bare in the low light of the garage. She looked at them, at the scars she'd carried since. Before she knew how to cook anything more than the boxed macaroni she'd been responsible for making on the nights her mother worked late. 11 years of keeping those arms covered. 11 years of long sleeves in Georgia summers. 11 years of answering, I'm just cold, or it's a habit when people asked. She was tired of that particular performance. She thought about the woman she'd been at 16, in that hallway in Valdosta, and what that woman could not have known about who was coming next. What hands those hands would become, what they would learn to do, what they would build and repair and coax into being, what they would rescue from a broken sauce on a night that actually mattered. She drove home with the windows down. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't need it. The night was warm and the road was clear. And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, the weight in the center of her chest below the collarbone. The weight she'd been holding and managing and carrying forward like luggage she'd packed at 16 was lighter. Not gone. She wasn't made of the material that allowed for gone, but lighter. Enough. There is a version of this story where Sera Drummond walked out of that kitchen on the 41st night and never went back, where she took Voss's words and added them to the long ledger of things people had taken from her, and let that be the end of it. Most people, faced with that night, would have walked. She didn't walk because she had learned something in those years between Valdosta and that alley behind Maison that most people spend their whole lives trying to learn, and some never do. That the opinion of someone who has decided who you are before watching what you do is not information. It is noise, and you do not leave a room because of noise. The ones who are loudest about who you cannot be are almost always wrong. They are working from a resume, from a credential, from a surface. They are not working from watching your hands. Let them watch your hands. That's all you ever needed to do.